In the endless winds of the Asian steppe, where survival was a battle against nature itself, a boy was born who would one day change the destiny of the world. His name was Temujin, but history remembers him as Genghis Khan, the lord of the Mongols, the master of an empire that stretched farther than Rome or Alexander's ever dreamed. His story is not only about conquest, but about resilience, betrayal, genius, and an unstoppable will. From a child abandoned in the cold to the most feared and respected ruler of his age, the path he carved is filled with mystery, shadows, and moments that still echo through centuries. Tonight we begin the journey into his life. Before we start, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let us step into the winds of the steppe and discover the life of Genghis Khan. In the vast and unforgiving steppes of Mongolia, where the horizon seems endless and the sky stretches with a cold, eternal blue, life in the 12th century was a relentless struggle. It was into this raw, merciless land that a boy named Temujin was born around the year 1162. The Mongol tribes who roamed these plains were fractured, bound by bloodlines, yet torn apart by feuds, rivalries, and ambitions. Power shifted constantly, and alliances that held one season could collapse the next. It was a world where loyalty was fragile and survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to adapt to betrayal as easily as to the changing winds. Into this turbulence, Temujin took his first breath, destined to become not just a survivor, but a figure who would redefine empire. Temujin's father was Yesugei, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man respected for his authority yet vulnerable in a society where authority was challenged at every turn. His mother, Holun, had herself been seized in a raid, taken from another tribe and forced into this new life. This was the way of the steppe. Families were built not only by love or choice, but by conquest, by the power to take and to keep. From the beginning, Temujin's existence was marked by both violence and resilience. Born from a woman who adapted to captivity and a man who carried the burden of leadership in a divided land. As a child, Temujin grew up in the midst of endless skirmishes and political intrigues. He was not born into a stable dynasty with secure borders. Instead, he entered a realm where chieftains waged war over grazing lands, horses, and honor. In such a society, children learned early that the world could turn hostile without warning. It was not an environment that nurtured innocence. For Temujin, lessons about trust and fear came quickly, and the steppe itself was both his teacher and his testing ground. When Temujin was still young, his father arranged a marriage alliance for him. This was common practice among tribes, where marriages served not only to unite families, but to strengthen fragile political ties. The girl chosen was Berta, and although they were too young to wed immediately, the promise had been set, binding two clans together for the future. For Yesugei, this alliance was a step toward greater stability, a way to secure his son's future in a world where nothing was guaranteed. Yet fate had other plans, and the path to power would soon twist violently. It was during one of Yesugei's journeys, when he accompanied Temujin to meet his future bride's family, that disaster struck. On his return, the chieftain encountered members of a rival tribe. Following the ancient code of hospitality, they offered him food and drink. But the offer concealed treachery. The cup was poisoned, and the proud Borjigin leader fell victim to the silent dagger of deceit. The betrayal was swift and irreversible. Within days, Yesugei lay dying, and with him, the fragile security of his family collapsed into uncertainty. Temujin was only 9 years old. The death of Yesugei left Holun and her children dangerously exposed. Without the protection of their father, the Borjigin clan turned against them. In the brutal logic of the steppe, weakness was a liability, and a widow with young children was no longer a leader's household, but a burden to be discarded. The clan abandoned them, leaving Holun to fend for herself with her sons and daughters. It was an act of betrayal that etched itself into Temujin's soul, a reminder that loyalty was conditional, and that in the world he inhabited, survival was not guaranteed by kinship, but earned through strength. The family now stood alone, stripped of status, of herds, of protection. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. They gathered roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. Holen, fierce and unyielding, became the pillar holding the children together. She taught them to scrape life from the earth when there was no one to defend them. For Temujin, these years carved lessons deeper than any formal instruction: the endurance to withstand starvation, the suspicion of false allies, and the fire of anger at betrayal. Among the siblings, rivalries also festered. In this crucible of hardship, even brothers could become threats. Temujin clashed with his half-brother Bekta, disputes over food and authority escalating until one day the conflict turned fatal. Temujin and his full brother Kasar killed Bekta, asserting dominance but also confirming that survival, even within a family, demanded ruthless choices. The act stained his childhood with blood, but it also foreshadowed the decisive will he would later wield over empires. Yet Temujin was not without bonds of loyalty. In these early years, he began forming friendships that would carry through his rise. Most notable was his relationship with Jamuka, a boy of similar age, with whom he shared the ancient ritual of Anda, or sworn brotherhood. To be Anda was more than friendship. It was a sacred tie of loyalty and mutual protection. In Jamuka, Temujin found not just companionship but an ally, though the future would twist this bond into rivalry and bitter war. For now, in the cold and uncertain days of his youth, it was a connection that gave him hope. Life did not ease its grip. At one point, Temujin was captured by the Taichi Ud, enemies who sought to break him before he could become a threat. Bound with a wooden collar, paraded as a prisoner, he endured humiliation and the prospect of an early death. Yet he refused to yield. In a daring escape, aided by the sympathy of a guard's family, Temujin slipped free into the night. This escape was more than survival. It was proof of his resilience, a whisper of the destiny he would one day claim. These early experiences, his father's murder, his family's abandonment, the endless hunger, the killing of his brother, the loyalty of Jamuka, the chains of captivity, were the elements that shaped him. They forged within Temujin a vision of leadership rooted not in privilege, but in necessity. He understood that trust must be earned, that merit was more valuable than noble blood, and that betrayal was always a possibility. Out of despair, he nurtured ambition. Out of suffering, he drew strength. The boy of the steppes, barefoot and hungry, carried scars both visible and invisible. But he also carried within him a will as sharp as the winds that tore across the plains. In the years to come, this will would propel him to gather followers, to reclaim his status, and to begin the long, merciless path from outcast to conqueror. For now, he was still a boy, hardened by betrayal and tempered by hunger, standing against a world that had tried to discard him. And though few could see it yet, the fire of Genghis Khan had already been lit. The years after his escape from captivity left Temujin wandering between hope and desperation. A boy still too young to command armies, yet already marked by scars that most men never carried in a lifetime. The collar of wood that once pressed against his neck was gone, but the memory of humiliation lingered. He knew then that he would never again allow himself to be bound, and he would never forgive the kind of weakness that invited chains. In the boundless steppes where survival depended not only on strength, but on shrewd alliances, Temujin began to sharpen both. Although he had been abandoned by his own clan, he did not walk the plains alone. He drew around him small groups of companions, some relatives, others young men who, like him, had little to lose but much to gain. Among these were brothers who had shared his hardship, and allies who saw in Temujin a resilience that set him apart from other outcasts. These were not men of wealth or lineage, but they were bound to him by necessity, by trust forged in fire. For them, he was not yet a Khan, but a leader in spirit, a young man who endured when others broke. The concept of sworn brotherhood, the sacred Anda bond, continued to shape his early journey. Jamuka, his childhood companion, remained one of the most significant figures in his youth. Together, they shared hunts, meals, and dreams of glory that seemed impossibly distant for boys with so few resources. The Anda oath meant loyalty as strong as kinship, an alliance not of blood but of choice. Yet within the bond also lay the seeds of rivalry, for in a world where leadership meant life or death, even sworn brothers could be drawn apart by ambition. For now, Their brotherhood was a source of strength. The life of an outcast was merciless. Food was scarce, winters bitter, and every encounter with rival tribes carried the risk of death. Temujin learned to stalk the steppe as if it were a battlefield, moving quietly, taking what little the land would yield, and staying invisible when danger loomed. Hunting with his bow, fishing in half-frozen rivers, and gathering whatever roots and berries could sustain him, he developed instincts that would serve him later as a commander. He read the land, watched the sky, and learned how to endure when others would surrender to despair. These skills did not simply keep him alive. They gave him an edge in a culture where only the strong, cunning, and adaptive could hope to rule. But Temujin's youth was not only about survival against nature. It was equally about navigating the web of human loyalties and betrayals. The tribes of the Mongolian steppe were never still. Leaders rose and fell, and men pledged their allegiance to whichever chief could promise protection and plunder. Temujin began to recognize that to gather followers, one needed more than bloodline. It required trust, fairness, and vision. He was young, yet already he broke from tradition by valuing loyalty over lineage. Those who served him, even if they were of low birth, could find themselves closer to his inner circle than a noble of higher standing. This approach would later transform him from mere outcast into a magnet for warriors disillusioned by the rigid hierarchies of tribal life. Still, these were fragile beginnings. He had no great army, no herds to secure wealth, no fortress to defend. He had only determination, the loyalty of a few companions, and the memory of his father's poisoned death, which burned like an ember in his heart. Each step forward was a gamble. Every alliance he sought could either strengthen his fragile standing or lead him into another betrayal. It was during these uncertain years that his reputation for cunning began to form. Rivals who underestimated the orphaned son of Yasuge sometimes found themselves surprised by his resilience. He learned to strike when opportunity appeared, to retreat when the odds were hopeless, and to inspire those around him with promises of a better order. Slowly, whispers spread across the plains that this boy, though stripped of wealth and status, possessed an iron will that could not easily be crushed. Yet the steppe had not finished testing him. The Taichi Ud, the same enemies who once held him captive, remained a threat. They had mocked him, humiliated him, and tried to make an example of him. His escape was not forgotten, and they sought to drag him back into chains. For Temujin, this was not just a danger, but a challenge. The young leader had no great army to face them, but he carried the lessons of hardship, and he knew how to vanish into the landscape, how to strike quickly and disappear like a shadow on horseback. These skirmishes honed his skills, reminding him that survival depended on discipline as much as courage. His alliances deepened as he gathered more companions. He began to attract men who were drawn not only to his determination, but to his sense of justice, rare on the steppe. Unlike other leaders who rewarded family above all, Temujin distributed responsibilities based on ability. A man of low birth could rise if he proved his worth. In a culture where rigid tradition often crushed ambition, this principle stood out as revolutionary. It gave men reason to follow him, not just out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty. Still, betrayal stalked him like a constant shadow. Among those who joined him were opportunists who sought only personal gain, ready to shift allegiance to whichever chief appeared stronger. Temujin felt the sting of treachery more than once, betrayed by men he trusted, forced to learn that trust could never be given lightly. Each betrayal hardened him, but it also refined his understanding of power. Leadership was not about ruling over men by force alone. It was about creating a system where loyalty was worth more than desertion, where men saw advantage in staying true rather than turning traitor. The young outcast's name began to travel farther than the boundaries of his immediate clan. Small victories, narrow escapes, and his growing band of companions marked him as someone to be watched. He was still a minor figure compared to the great tribal chiefs of the time, but his story was beginning to spread in whispers, carried by riders across the plains. The boy who should have been destroyed had instead become a thorn in the side of rivals, a survivor with ambition greater than his circumstances. Temujin's cunning was most evident in the way he cultivated alliances. He understood the importance of marriage ties, trade, and symbolic gestures. His betrothal to Berta remained an anchor for his ambitions, a promise not only of companionship, but of legitimacy. In her family, he saw an opportunity to strengthen his fragile position, though he also knew that such alliances were fragile in a world where power shifted like sand in the wind. Every season that passed added weight to his growing legend. He had not yet become the lord of the Mongols, but already he had shown that resilience could transform into influence, and influence into power. The boy abandoned by his clan was becoming a leader who could not be ignored. Each betrayal, each hardship, each narrow escape added another layer of steel to his character. In these formative years, Temujin began to grasp the deeper truth of leadership. That fear alone could not hold men together, that promises alone could not inspire them, but that a balance of both, fear and hope, justice and severity, could forge bonds stronger than blood. He was still young, but already he embodied the paradox that would one day make him a conqueror. Merciless in the face of treachery, yet capable of loyalty so fierce it inspired devotion. And so, in the windswept plains, where survival was victory and betrayal an ever-present threat, the legend of Temujin slowly took shape. His reputation for strength and cunning had only begun to spread, but it was enough to mark him as a figure of destiny. The boy who had once known hunger, chains, and abandonment was now stepping towards something larger, something that would one day shake the foundations of the world. With each passing season, Temujin grew beyond the shadow of an abandoned child. His resilience and cunning began to attract not only wandering outcasts, but warriors who sought something greater than the fragile promises of their own tribal leaders. He was not yet a Khan, not yet the master of an empire, but his vision for a different kind of order gave him an aura of purpose. To men weary of betrayal, he represented the possibility of a leader who valued loyalty over bloodline, discipline over chaos, and justice over favoritism. These small beginnings marked the first rise of Temujin as a leader, a transformation from survivor to commander. At the center of his ambitions was the marriage promised in his childhood. Berta, the daughter of the Ongirat clan, was more than a bride. She represented an alliance that could anchor Temujin's fragile authority. When the time came, he traveled to her people, who still remembered the bond forged by his father Yesuge years before. Despite his family's decline and his years of hardship, the Ongirat elders honored the agreement. Temujin and Berta were united, not only in ceremony but in spirit, for Berta herself would become a central figure in his life, a partner whose loyalty endured through devastation. With her, Temujin gained not only legitimacy, but also the support of her family, who gifted a precious black sable coat. This coat would become Temujin's most valuable possession, not because of its material worth, but because of the way he used it. Rather than keep it, he presented it to Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Keret tribe, a man who had once been an ally of his father. In a world where gestures often spoke louder than words, this act was both respectful and strategic. By offering the sable coat, Temujin reminded Togrul of his old ties to Yesuge and placed himself under the protection of a far stronger ally. It was an early example of how Temujin leveraged not only force, but also diplomacy and symbolism to advance his position. For a moment, it seemed as though his fortunes were turning. He had a wife of noble blood, the backing of a powerful Khan, and the loyalty of his growing band of warriors. Yet the steppe was never free from shadows, and tragedy soon struck. The Merkits, a rival tribe, descended upon Temujin's camp in a sudden raid. They remembered the past, for it was Temujin's father who had once taken Holun, Temujin's mother, from their people. Now they sought revenge. In the chaos of the attack, Berta was seized and carried away, a captive in the hands of enemies. The loss was devastating. Berta was more than his wife. She was the embodiment of the stability he had struggled to secure, the symbol of an alliance that gave him legitimacy. Her abduction was not only a personal wound, but a political disaster. For Temujin, it reopened the scars of his childhood, the memory of being abandoned, the sting of betrayal, the sense of powerlessness. Yet unlike the boy who had once been left to starve, Temujin was no longer defenseless. The tragedy became fuel for his determination, a moment that hardened his resolve to build a power strong enough that no enemy could ever again strip him of what he held dear. Temujin turned immediately to his allies. He sought out Togrul, reminding him of the gift of the sable coat and the bond of loyalty it represented. He also reached out to Jamuka, his sworn Anda, appealing to their brotherhood and shared dreams of greatness. Together, they assembled a formidable force to strike against the Merkits. For the first time, Temujin commanded not just his small band of companions, but a coalition of warriors drawn from multiple clans. It was a test not only of his leadership, but of his vision to unite fractured tribes under a common cause. The campaign against the Merkits was swift and merciless. Temujin's forces struck with precision, and in the battle that followed, the Merkits were crushed. Berta was rescued and returned to him, though the scars of her abduction would linger. Some accounts suggest that she had been given to another man during her captivity, and questions over the paternity of her firstborn son, Jochi, would haunt Temujin for years. Yet whatever doubts lingered, Temujin stood by Berta, refusing to cast her aside. His loyalty to her, even in the face of uncertainty, reflected his belief in bonds that transcended blood. It also reinforced his growing reputation as a leader who valued loyalty above circumstance. The rescue of Berta was more than a personal triumph. It marked a turning point in Temujin's rise. For the first time, he had led a coalition into battle and emerged victorious. Warriors who had once dismissed him as an orphan with little chance of survival now saw in him a commander capable of inspiring unity, delivering justice and protecting his people. His reputation spread beyond his immediate allies, and his name began to carry weight among the tribes of the steppe. Yet even as he celebrated victory, Temujin recognized the fragility of alliances. Jamuka, though still his sworn brother, was ambitious in his own right. Togrul, though an ally, was a Khan with his own interests. Temujin understood that loyalty on the steppe was often temporary, bound more to opportunity than to principle. He would need to shape a new kind of order, one where loyalty was rewarded not just with promises, but with fairness and a system that transcended traditional tribal favoritism. The pain of Berta's abduction etched itself into Temujin's vision of justice. He had seen how raids and revenge perpetuated cycles of violence, how families were torn apart by endless feuding. He believed there had to be another way, a system that could unify the tribes under laws stronger than vengeance. This idea, still unformed, would later crystallize into his code of Yasa. But even in these early years, the seeds of that vision were being sown. For Temujin, unity was not just a path to power. It was a shield against the kind of tragedy that had scarred his life. As he gathered followers, Temujin introduced principles that set him apart from other chiefs. He distributed rewards based on merit rather than noble birth, elevating warriors who proved their loyalty and skill. He demanded discipline, punishing theft and betrayal, and insisted that his men fight not just for plunder, but for the collective survival of the group. These were small steps, but they were revolutionary in a society long bound by tradition and favoritism. Slowly, men began to see that service under Temujin offered more than just temporary gain. It offered a new order where fairness had weight. The years following Berta's rescue were marked by growth. Temujin's band of warriors expanded, his alliances deepened, and his reputation as a rising leader spread across the plains. He was no longer simply the son of a murdered chieftain or the boy abandoned by his clan. He was becoming a figure who embodied strength, justice, and vision. Each hardship he had endured, each betrayal he had survived, now converged into a leadership style that was both merciless against enemies and loyal to those who served him faithfully. Still, the steppe was far from unified. Rivals loomed, ambitions clashed, and even among his closest allies, shadows of envy and suspicion stirred. Temujin's rise was only beginning, and the same forces that had helped him rescue Berta would one day turn against him. For now, however, he stood taller than ever before, a leader forged by pain, sharpened by betrayal, and driven by a determination that no tragedy could extinguish. The boy who had once wandered hungry and forgotten had become a commander whose name carried weight, and whose vision was beginning to take shape across the windswept steppes. The rescue of Berta had given Temujin more than his wife and partner back. It had given him the credibility of victory. Yet credibility on the Mongolian steppe was a fragile thing, easily won, easily lost, and always tested in the fires of war. Temujin understood that he could not rest on a single triumph. To secure lasting power, he needed not only followers, but a vision that could draw together the endlessly divided tribes. The old order of favoritism and shifting allegiances had failed him as a boy, and now he sought to replace it with a system that rewarded loyalty, discipline, and skill. This was the foundation upon which he would begin unifying rival clans under his banner. The first challenge was to transform a band of warriors into a disciplined force. Most tribal chiefs relied on kinship networks, favoring relatives and nobles in distributing power. Temujin rejected this. Instead, he elevated men of talent regardless of their lineage. A herder of humble birth could rise to command if he demonstrated courage and loyalty. By doing so, Temujin undermined the rigid aristocratic structures that had defined Mongol life for generations. To his followers, this meritocratic approach was radical, even shocking, but it inspired fierce devotion. For the first time, men felt that service and loyalty, rather than bloodline, could carve them a place in history. Temujin's vision of order extended beyond meritocracy. He demanded discipline in every aspect of life. Loot from raids was no longer distributed haphazardly, but carefully divided under his direction. Theft was punished, disobedience met with swift justice. For a people accustomed to chaos and personal gain, these rules were severe, but they brought a new kind of stability. His followers began to see that under Temujin, survival was no longer left to chance or to the whims of rival chiefs. There was structure, purpose, and justice, qualities rare in the shifting sands of steppe politics. As his following grew, so too did the challenges. Other chieftains viewed him with suspicion, recognizing that his meritocratic system threatened their own authority. Among the most significant relationships of this period was his continued alliance with Jamuka. As sworn Anda, their bond had deep roots, but both men were ambitious and both sought leadership beyond the small circles of their clans. For a time, they shared power, commanding a joint force that struck fear into rivals. Together, they launched raids, defeated enemies, and grew in stature. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Temujin's merit-based promotions angered Jamuka, who clung to the traditional aristocratic order. The breaking point came when Temujin formally declared himself Khan of his followers, distinguishing his authority from that of Jamuka. Many warriors, inspired by Temujin's fairness and discipline, chose to remain with him, even if it meant breaking ties with their noble leaders. Jamuka, insulted and enraged, responded by rallying his own supporters, gathering an army far larger than Temujin's. The stage was set for a confrontation not only between two men, but between two visions of leadership. The battle that followed was brutal. Jamuka's forces outnumbered Temujin's, and for a time, it seemed that the weight of numbers would crush him. Yet Temujin's discipline and strategy shone through. His men fought in organized units, obeying commands with precision, while Jamuka's larger host often dissolved into chaos. The clash lasted days, and though Temujin ultimately suffered defeat, his reputation did not diminish. His ability to hold his own against a force twice his size, his insistence on order, and the loyalty of his men proved to the steppe that this young leader was no ordinary chieftain. Even in defeat, Temujin learned lessons that shaped his future campaigns. He saw how numbers could be deceiving, how discipline could counter chaos, and how loyalty could withstand even the worst setbacks. Many of his men, though bloodied, remained devoted to him, refusing to abandon their leader even in the face of Jamuka's temporary ascendancy. In the world of constant betrayal, this steadfastness was rare, and it strengthened Temujin's belief that his system of merit and justice was the key to enduring power. As the years passed, Temujin slowly rebuilt. He struck alliances with smaller tribes dissatisfied with Jamuka's aristocratic favoritism. He courted the support of Togrul of the Kerit, who continued to act as a powerful patron. Through diplomacy, raids, and promises of fairness, he expanded his influence across the steppe. Each new tribe that submitted to him was reorganized, its warriors divided among his units, preventing the old rivalries from festering. By breaking down clan divisions and mixing men into new units, he created an army bound not by family ties, but by loyalty to him personally. This reorganization was revolutionary. The old way had kept warriors loyal first to their kin, second to their chieftain, and only distantly to a Khan. Temujin inverted this structure. Now warriors swore their primary loyalty to him, their great leader, while their kinship ties mattered far less. This not only dissolved the fractious rivalries that plagued Mongol politics, but also ensured that betrayal became far more difficult. For Temujin, trust was no longer based on blood. It was built on proven loyalty and discipline. The campaigns he launched during this period were not only about expanding territory, they were about spreading his vision of order. Villages and camps that resisted him were crushed, while those who submitted often found themselves treated with fairness. His reputation as a formidable warlord grew, not simply because of the victories he achieved, but because of the system he established in their aftermath. Stories spread of how Temujin rewarded courage, punished treachery, and created stability in a land long defined by chaos. By the time he emerged from these years of struggle, Temujin was no longer seen as an upstart orphan trying to carve a place for himself. He was recognized as a rising force, a leader who could not be ignored. His army, though still smaller than that of the great tribal confederations, was more disciplined, more loyal, and more effective than any other on the steppe. His reputation as a warlord was now firmly established, and even rivals began to acknowledge his growing power. The unification of the Mongol tribes was far from complete, but the foundations had been laid. Temujin's principles of meritocracy, discipline, and loyalty had transformed his band of followers into a force that could challenge even the mightiest chiefs. His victories and his defeats had both served as lessons, sharpening his strategies and deepening the devotion of his men. Slowly, tribe by tribe, alliance by alliance, battle by battle, he was weaving together the fractured peoples of the steppe into a single fabric of loyalty bound to him. What had begun as the struggle of an abandoned child was now becoming something far greater. Temujin was no longer merely surviving. He was reshaping the very nature of Mongol society. His rise as a warlord marked the beginning of a transformation that would one day thunder across continents. For now the winds of the steppe carried his name farther than ever before, a name spoken with respect, with fear, and with the recognition that a formidable leader had emerged among the clans. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamuka, once sworn brothers bound by the sacred ritual of Anda, had escalated into a war that would define the destiny of the Mongol steppe. What began as companionship, a bond forged in childhood and mutual hardship, had transformed into bitter enmity, a conflict rooted in ambition, philosophy, and the stark differences in their vision of leadership. Jamuka clung to the old aristocratic order, favoring nobles for promotion, while Temujin insisted that merit, loyalty, and proven skill should determine rank. This ideological clash, combined with personal pride and lingering grievances from their youth, made reconciliation impossible. By this point, Temujin had gathered a substantial following of warriors who trusted his leadership and his vision of fairness. Yet Jamuka commanded an even larger force, drawing hundreds of men loyal to the old ways. The Mongolian steppe, a land defined by shifting loyalties and opportunistic alliances, became a chessboard of strategy, where each chief maneuvered carefully to expand influence without overextending. Both leaders knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable, but the timing and conditions would be critical to success or ruin. The decisive clash occurred when Temujin and Jamuka's armies met on the open plains. Jamuka, confident in his numerical superiority, struck first. The battle was fierce, a brutal demonstration of steppe warfare, with thousands of riders, swords, and arrows clashing in a cloud of dust and blood. Despite being outnumbered, Temujin's forces fought with unprecedented discipline. His units were organized, coordinated, and loyal, responding to commands with precision that amazed even the seasoned warriors of the steppe. Yet, Jamuka's superior numbers proved decisive in the engagement. Temujin's forces were overwhelmed, forced into retreat, and many of his followers were captured. The aftermath of this confrontation was both politically and personally devastating. Jamuka, emboldened by victory, executed 70 of Temujin's captured men in a display of brutal retribution. The executions were not simply punitive, they were a warning to all who might challenge his authority. For Temujin, the act was a bitter lesson in the ruthlessness of his rivals. It confirmed the necessity of loyalty that was earned, of alliances that could withstand betrayal, and of leadership that demanded both cunning and foresight. This cruelty, however, only deepened his resolve. He understood that to survive and eventually unify the Mongols, he would need to outthink as well as outfight his enemies. Retreating with the remnants of his forces, Temujin turned to diplomacy and alliance building. He recognized that his path to power could not rely on force alone. He forged new alliances with smaller tribes, dissatisfied with Jamuka's leadership, offering them protection and fair treatment in exchange for loyalty. These alliances were fragile, contingent on both trust and the tangible benefits of joining his cause. Temujin's approach contrasted sharply with Jamuka, who relied on fear and status rather than fairness and shared purpose. Gradually, Temujin's reputation as a leader who rewarded merit and protected those under his command began to draw followers away from Jamuka's orbit. Betrayals and defections were constant, yet Temujin had learned to anticipate them. He cultivated intelligence networks, sending spies and scouts to monitor both allies and enemies. Rumors of treachery were confirmed or dispelled before they could erupt into violence, and potential defectors were addressed swiftly, either by negotiation or by demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty. These tactics allowed Temujin to maintain cohesion in a period when loyalty could easily dissolve, and they reinforced the emerging principle that service under him came with both opportunity and responsibility. The rivalry with Jamuka also forced Temujin to refine his military strategies. He introduced new formations and tactics, dividing his forces into units that could act independently, yet converge in coordinated attacks. Mobility and surprise became hallmarks of his campaigns, exploiting weaknesses in the larger, less disciplined forces of his adversaries. Temujin learned to use terrain, weather, and timing to offset numerical disadvantages, demonstrating an understanding of strategy that would later become legendary. Even in temporary defeat, he gleaned lessons that strengthened his leadership and inspired confidence among his followers. As the struggle continued, Temujin's moral vision began to take shape. He realized that enduring power required more than victory on the battlefield. It required a system in which loyalty was rewarded, justice was seen as impartial, and personal bonds could be trusted. The execution of his men by Jamuka had revealed the fragility of traditional authority, and Temujin determined to create a leadership structure that would prevent such arbitrary cruelty. He elevated men based on proven ability rather than noble birth, redistributed wealth and resources to ensure fairness, and instituted rules to bind his growing coalition together. These measures were revolutionary for the Mongol tribes, reshaping the culture of leadership. The rivalry reached its turning point when smaller tribes and disaffected warriors began to shift allegiance from Jamuka to Temujin. His reputation for fairness and discipline contrasted with Jamuka's reliance on fear and favoritism. Tribes that had once fought against him now pledged loyalty, swelling the ranks of his forces. Temujin's growing strength, combined with his strategic acumen, made Jamuka increasingly vulnerable despite his initial victories. The tide of influence was turning, and Temujin's vision of uniting the Mongols under a single disciplined, loyal force was becoming plausible. Finally, in a series of battles marked by cunning maneuvers and the careful timing of assaults, Temujin gradually eroded Jamuka's power base. His victories were not merely martial triumphs, they were demonstrations of the efficacy of his leadership principles. Warriors who had once doubted him were now convinced of his capability, and his influence spread beyond immediate allies to encompass tribes that had previously been enemies. The steppe, once fragmented by endless feuds, began to recognize a new force emerging, one that combined ruthless efficiency in battle with disciplined governance and meritocratic principles. The resolution of Temujin's struggle with Jamuka did not occur without lingering tension. Though Jamuka's power waned, the memories of betrayal and bloodshed remained. Temujin would later show mercy, a pragmatic decision to consolidate power while signaling fairness to those who might still resist. His ability to balance ruthlessness with calculated leniency, discipline with reward, became a hallmark of his leadership style. The steppe, long ruled by shifting loyalties and brutality, was beginning to witness a transformation in the nature of authority. By the end of this period, Temujin had emerged not only as a survivor, but as a commander of men who respected him, feared him, and increasingly believed in the vision he offered. His battles with Jamuka, the betrayals endured, and the shifting alliances navigated, had forged a leader capable of uniting the Mongols in a way no one before him had attempted. The crucible of rivalry had tested his resolve, refined his strategies, and prepared him for the next stage of his rise, the declaration of a universal Khan and the creation of an empire that would span continents. The year 1206 marked a turning point in the history of the Mongol steppe. After decades of struggle, betrayal, and unrelenting ambition, Temujin stood at the summit of tribal politics. The fractures that had long divided the Mongols were finally beginning to close, and the tribes convened in a grand assembly known as a Kurultai to decide the fate of leadership. It was here that Temujin, the boy once abandoned by his clan, would be proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, a title that signified authority not merely over one tribe, but over all Mongols who would pledge loyalty to him. The declaration was more than ceremonial. It represented the culmination of years of unification, strategy, and visionary leadership. Tribes that had once fought each other under shifting alliances now recognized a singular authority, and Temujin's rise was legitimized by the collective endorsement of leaders who understood that the old ways had failed. By centralizing leadership under his command, he laid the foundations for a unified polity capable of enduring far beyond the transient victories of individual chieftains. In that moment, the fragmented tribes of the steppe were transformed into the core of a nascent empire. With authority secured, Genghis Khan turned immediately to the structuring of society under his rule. Central to his vision was the implementation of a legal code known as the Yasa. Though its precise contents remain partly shrouded in history, the Yasa codified principles that combined justice, discipline, and loyalty. Theft and betrayal were punished with severity, yet obedience and service were rewarded. It emphasized the protection of families and property, the fairness of military rewards, and the responsibility of leaders toward their followers. Through the Yasa, Genghis Khan sought to create a framework that would prevent the cycles of vengeance that had so long dominated steppe life. Beyond the legal code, Genghis Khan restructured society in profound ways. The old system of clan-based hierarchy, which had privileged noble birth over talent, was dismantled. He divided his forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, mixing warriors from different clans to prevent old rivalries from undermining loyalty. Command positions were assigned based on merit and proven ability rather than family ties. This approach not only enhanced military efficiency, but also fostered a sense of fairness that encouraged loyalty and minimized dissent. Soldiers and commanders alike knew that courage and skill could elevate them, while cowardice and disloyalty would lead to punishment or removal. The creation of a disciplined, loyal, and organized military was inseparable from his broader vision for governance. Genghis Khan understood that a strong army was essential, not merely for conquest, but for enforcing order and stability across the newly unified Mongols. Every member of his forces had responsibilities, from the lowliest scout to the highest general, and all were accountable to the Khan. This structure, though rigid, was innovative, and it allowed him to coordinate large-scale campaigns with precision that far exceeded the capabilities of traditional tribal armies. Administration extended beyond the military. Genghis Khan reorganized the collection and distribution of resources, ensuring that food, horses, and wealth were managed to support both warfare and the well-being of his people. He encouraged trade and communication among tribes, creating networks that connected distant regions of the steppe. While conquest remained a tool of expansion, these internal reforms emphasized sustainability, cohesion, and order, qualities that distinguished his emerging empire from the transient power struggles of earlier leaders. Religious tolerance became another hallmark of his governance. Genghis Khan recognized the diversity of beliefs among the tribes and across conquered territories. Shamanism, Buddhism, Islam, and other faiths were allowed to coexist, and leaders of religious communities were often granted protection in exchange for their support or neutrality. This pragmatic approach reduced internal conflict and encouraged loyalty among diverse populations. By fostering a system where belief could not be a source of division, he further strengthened the cohesion of his empire. The Kurultai that declared him universal ruler also reinforced his authority by formalizing his relations with key allies and family members. Loyal companions, former rivals who had been won over by his fairness or military skill, and members of his own family were given roles that consolidated power while preventing any one group from dominating the whole. Genghis Khan's leadership style, a combination of reward for merit and careful balance of interests, minimized internal rebellion and maximized the efficiency of governance. The foundations laid in 1206 also established a pattern for expansion. By creating a disciplined, organized society with codified law and meritocratic principles, Genghis Khan had constructed a framework capable of sustaining conquests far beyond the steppe. Unlike previous leaders who relied on charisma alone or ephemeral alliances, he now possessed institutions that could endure, adapt, and enforce loyalty across vast territories. His empire was no longer a coalition of temporary alliances, but a structured system capable of projection and consolidation of power. Even as Genghis Khan celebrated his authority, he did not underestimate the challenges that lay ahead. Rival tribes still resisted, external enemies lingered beyond the borders, and internal dissent could arise at any moment. Yet the tools he now possessed, discipline, organization, meritocratic loyalty, and codified law, provided him with a distinct advantage. The boy who had survived abandonment, betrayal, and personal loss had been transformed into a sovereign capable of reshaping the world. The declaration of Genghis Khan and the creation of the Yasa marked the turning point from tribal chief to imperial ruler. What had begun as a struggle for survival and local dominance had evolved into a vision of unified leadership, justice, and sustainable power. His ability to enforce discipline, reward loyalty, and structure society for efficiency would define his campaigns in the years to come, preparing the Mongols for the conquests that would extend their reach across continents. In that moment, the vast steppes were no longer simply a collection of warring tribes. They had become the heart of a burgeoning empire, guided by a leader whose vision combined pragmatism, innovation, and relentless ambition. Genghis Khan had emerged not merely as a conqueror, but as a sovereign capable of shaping the future of Eurasia. The transformation was complete. The boy of the steppe had become a ruler whose authority, law, and organization would endure long after the dust of individual battles had settled. Having solidified his authority over the Mongol tribes, Genghis Khan turned his gaze beyond the steppe, toward lands rich with cities, fortified walls, and wealth that dwarfed the simple herding communities of Mongolia. The first major external campaigns would test his leadership, strategy, and vision, in a realm far removed from the nomadic skirmishes of his youth. His eyes fell upon the Xixia and Jin dynasties, powerful states in northern China, whose wealth, resources, and population promised both opportunity and peril. These campaigns marked the transformation of Genghis Khan from steppe conqueror into a strategist capable of confronting the fortified civilizations of Asia. The Xixia, located in the western regions of northern China, presented the first challenge. Though smaller than the Jin dynasty to the east, the Xixia had well-defended cities and a disciplined army. Genghis Khan approached with characteristic preparation. Intelligence networks, previously used to monitor rival tribes, were adapted to gather information on the terrain, the layout of cities, the strength of garrisons, and the disposition of enemy troops. Scouts and spies moved silently through villages, rivers, and passes, returning with maps, troop movements, and even assessments of morale. Knowledge became as crucial as steel, and Genghis Khan understood that to defeat a fortified civilization, he needed both insight and cunning. When the Mongols approached the walls of Xixia cities, siege tactics became essential. The steppe-born warriors, experts in mounted archery and rapid mobility, now confronted stone fortifications designed to withstand assault. Genghis Khan combined ingenuity with terror. Siege engines adapted from designs observed in previous raids or obtained through captured craftsmen allowed him to hurl stones and projectiles over walls. Simultaneously, he employed psychological tactics, spreading rumors, exploiting fear, and sometimes offering terms of surrender that sowed doubt among defenders. The combination of physical force and mental manipulation eroded the enemy's will even before battle fully began. Yet destruction was not indiscriminate. Genghis Khan understood the value of pragmatic diplomacy. Cities that surrendered quickly, acknowledging his authority and offering tribute, were often spared the devastation of full assault. Merchants and artisans were retained, and trade networks preserved. By balancing fear with opportunity, he ensured that conquered regions could contribute to his growing empire rather than collapse into rebellion or desolation. This dual approach, ruthless force tempered with calculated clemency, would become a hallmark of his campaigns. After the Xixia campaign, attention turned to the much larger and more powerful Jin dynasty in northern China. Here the challenges were immense. Dense cities, trained armies, and complex political structures demanded more than brute strength. Genghis Khan relied on intelligence once again, deploying spies to infiltrate court circles, monitor supply routes, and observe troop movements. He recognized that the enemy's own bureaucracy, often slow and rigid, could be exploited. Messages were intercepted, alliances were tested, and vulnerabilities carefully catalogued. For the Mongols, who had mastered mobility on the open steppe, the ability to operate effectively in the terrain of fortified states represented a strategic evolution. During the campaigns against the Jin, Genghis Khan's innovations extended to logistics and communication. Supply lines were organized with unprecedented efficiency, allowing armies to move swiftly despite the distances involved. Riders carried dispatches across vast distances, and units were divided into smaller mobile groups capable of rapid response. Each unit had a precise role, from direct assault to reconnaissance, ensuring that the larger army could operate as a coordinated whole. Discipline and organization transformed the Mongol cavalry from a nomadic raiding force into a sophisticated instrument of war. One particularly notable tactic involved the use of psychological warfare. Cities were warned of impending attacks, and envoys were sent with ultimatums that emphasized the inevitability of conquest. Resistance was framed as futile, surrender as rational. Those who resisted were made examples of with public displays of power designed to instill fear in neighboring regions. Genghis Khan understood the power of reputation. Each victory, each demonstration of ruthlessness magnified the perception of Mongol invincibility, sometimes causing opponents to surrender without fighting. At the same time, Genghis Khan did not underestimate diplomacy. Tribes and city-states that were willing to cooperate were integrated into his network of influence. Merchants were encouraged to continue trade, artisans were spared, and governance was reorganized to maintain stability. Through these measures, conquered territories became productive components of the empire, rather than merely trophies of war. This pragmatic approach to rule, balancing terror and tolerance, allowed Genghis Khan to consolidate authority efficiently while minimizing rebellion and unrest. The campaigns against Xixia and the Jin also highlighted the Mongol mastery of combined arms. Cavalry, infantry, and siege engines were employed in synchronized attacks, with archers providing constant harassment and engineers undermining walls or preparing breaches. Temujin's ability to coordinate these diverse elements reflected a level of strategic sophistication rarely seen among steppe leaders. He adapted lessons from each engagement, refining tactics that could be applied in future campaigns across varied terrain. Victory was not instantaneous. Prolonged sieges, winter campaigns, and resistance required patience and adaptation. Genghis Khan's leadership was tested repeatedly, and the loyalty of his commanders and soldiers was critical. Each success reinforced confidence in his authority, while failures provided lessons that improved subsequent operations. By the conclusion of these campaigns, the Mongols had demonstrated their capacity to challenge sophisticated, fortified states, a capability that would set the stage for later conquests in China, Central Asia, and beyond. The Xixia and Jin campaigns were as much about empire building as conquest, They forged the Mongol army into a disciplined, coordinated, and strategically flexible force. Intelligence, mobility, logistics, siegecraft, and psychological tactics combined to produce victories that reshaped the balance of power in northern China. Genghis Khan had evolved from a steppe warlord into a commander capable of confronting civilizations whose resources, fortifications, and armies dwarfed those of his earlier enemies. By the end of these campaigns, Genghis Khan had demonstrated the effectiveness of his vision, an army bound by discipline, loyalty, and merit, capable of both brutal force and pragmatic governance. The balance between destruction and diplomacy ensured that conquered territories could be incorporated into his growing empire. Northern China, with its wealth and population, provided the foundation for further expansion, and the lessons learned here would inform the Mongol approach to warfare and administration for decades to come. The success of these campaigns also solidified Genghis Khan's reputation across Asia. Tribes, city-states, and rival powers began to recognize that the Mongols were not merely raiders, but a formidable and disciplined force, capable of sophisticated strategy and long-term occupation. The Mongol Empire, still in its formative stages, was becoming a force that could project authority across vast territories, shaping both perception and reality with calculated precision. Having established dominion over the Mongol steppe and demonstrated his mastery against the fortified states of northern China, Genghis Khan turned his attention westward toward the rich cities and empires of Central Asia. These lands, crisscrossed by trade routes and fertile oases, were controlled by the Khwarezmian Empire, a state that stretched across Persia, Transoxiana, and parts of modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran. The empire's wealth and strategic position offered immense opportunity, but also required careful navigation of diplomacy, commerce, and power politics. For Genghis Khan, this campaign would become legendary, not only for its military brilliance, but also for the devastation that followed betrayal. The first contact with the Khwarezmian Empire came through trade. Caravan routes connected Mongol territories with the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, and Temujin sent envoys to establish peaceful commerce. Merchants carried goods, and in exchange tribute and safe passage were requested. Initially, the Khwarezmian Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad accepted the overtures. However, this fragile peace was shattered when the governor of Otrar, suspecting a Mongol plot, executed an entire Mongol trade delegation, seizing their goods and subjecting the merchants to humiliation and murder. This act was more than an offense. It was a betrayal that violated the rules of diplomacy and commerce that Genghis Khan considered sacred. The reaction was swift and merciless. Genghis Khan, who had often relied on both diplomacy and terror to secure obedience, now faced a situation in which words and negotiation had been ignored. His wrath was calculated but uncompromising. The Mongol army mobilized, moving with unprecedented speed across the steppes and deserts. The Mongols, hardened by decades of campaigning and disciplined by a meritocratic command, descended upon the cities of the Khwarezmian Empire with precision, striking at key urban centers and logistical nodes to destabilize the enemy's capacity for coordinated defense. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was marked by both strategic brilliance and ruthless retribution. The cities of Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand fell in succession, each demonstration of Mongol power leaving a clear message. Betrayal would not be tolerated, and defiance carried an ultimate cost. Siege engines, which Temujin had perfected in campaigns against northern China, were employed to breach walls, while cavalry units executed swift flanking maneuvers to prevent escape. Mongol forces often encircled cities, cutting off supplies and employing psychological tactics designed to demoralize defenders. The reputation of Mongol invincibility, built over years of campaigns, preceded them, leading some populations to surrender before the first arrow was fired. Yet where resistance persisted, destruction was absolute. Temujin's retribution for betrayal became legendary. In Otrar, the city that had executed his envoys, survivors were executed or enslaved, and the infrastructure destroyed. In Samarkand, where resistance had delayed surrender, the Mongols carried out mass killings, burning homes, granaries, and markets to prevent recovery. These massacres were not random acts of cruelty, but deliberate demonstrations of power, designed to enforce a code of respect and to deter future betrayal. The terror inflicted on the Khwarezmian cities echoed across Central Asia, spreading a cautionary tale that strengthened the Mongol reputation without requiring prolonged occupation of every territory. The speed and coordination of the campaign astonished contemporaries. Temujin divided his forces into highly mobile units capable of moving independently, yet capable of concentrating on key targets with deadly effect. Supply lines were maintained through careful planning, and intelligence networks provided continuous updates on enemy movements and terrain. This operational sophistication allowed the Mongols to traverse deserts, rivers, and mountain passes with an efficiency unmatched by their adversaries, often arriving at cities before defenders could fully organize. At the heart of the campaign lay the principle of accountability. The betrayal of the trade delegation had violated the Mongol code of diplomacy and honor, and the response was calculated to uphold the sanctity of such agreements. Temujin understood that if the Mongols were to rule a vast empire, trust in agreements between allies, subjects, and trading partners had to be enforced with credibility. By responding decisively to violation, he established a precedent. Diplomacy carried consequences, and betrayal would invoke the full might of Mongol power. The devastation was profound. Populations were decimated, and entire cities were left in ruins. Yet Genghis Khan also spared those who demonstrated submission and loyalty. Artisans, merchants, and skilled laborers were often integrated into the Mongol administrative and economic systems, ensuring that the conquered territories could contribute to the growing empire. This pragmatic approach, combining terror with calculated assimilation, allowed the Mongols to extract wealth and labor while consolidating control across vast regions. The conquest of Central Asia also demonstrated Genghis Khan's ability to adapt tactics to the challenges of geography and resistance. Armies traversed deserts with careful management of supplies and water, coordinated river crossings with precision, and employed deception to mislead enemy forces about their movements. Cities that believed themselves isolated found themselves besieged simultaneously from multiple directions, unable to predict Mongol strategies. This combination of mobility, intelligence, and psychological warfare reinforced the perception of Mongol omnipotence. Even as the devastation spread, Temujin maintained a strategic vision. He understood that the ultimate goal was not merely revenge, but the establishment of a unified empire with secure trade routes, resources, and the loyalty of subordinate rulers. Conquered regions were reorganized to ensure continued productivity and integration into the broader Mongol polity. Governors and administrators were appointed based on ability and loyalty, further extending the principles of meritocracy that had guided his rise among the Mongol tribes. The campaign left an indelible mark on history. Tales of the annihilation of cities, the destruction of populations, and the totality of Mongol retribution spread across Central Asia and beyond. Traders, diplomats, and rival rulers quickly learned the consequences of underestimating Genghis Khan. At the same time, the Mongols established systems of administration, trade, and governance that would endure in the conquered territories. The combination of fear, discipline, and pragmatism solidified both the empire's territorial gains and the reputation of its ruler. By the conclusion of the Central Asian campaigns, the Mongol Empire had grown far beyond the steppe. Temujin's wrath had been provoked, his justice meted with precision, and his military genius demonstrated in both devastation and organization. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire marked a turning point. Genghis Khan had shown that betrayal would never go unanswered, that no city or ruler was beyond his reach, and that the Mongols could dominate vast territories with a combination of terror strategy and disciplined governance. Central Asia, scarred yet integrated, became a critical foundation for the Mongol expansion that would follow across the Middle East and into Europe. By the later years of his life, Genghis Khan had transformed the Mongol Empire into a force unparalleled in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. What had begun as a struggle for survival on the windswept steppes of Mongolia had evolved into a vast empire, encompassing a diversity of peoples, cultures, and geographies. His military genius continued to manifest in campaigns that combined mobility, intelligence, and psychological strategy, while his visionary policies ensured that governance, trade, and cultural integration could endure far beyond the battlefield. The vast expanse of the empire demanded a system of administration capable of sustaining both control and cohesion. Genghis Khan divided his territories into administrative units, appointing trusted generals and relatives to oversee provinces, but always with a careful balance to prevent any one governor from accumulating too much power. Loyalty was rewarded and corruption punished. Written reports and messengers ensured that he maintained oversight even across distances that would have overwhelmed previous empires. This network of communication allowed for both rapid military response and efficient governance. Taxation and resource management became pillars of imperial stability. Conquered cities and regions were required to pay tribute in a structured manner, providing food, horses, and wealth to support the army and the state. Yet these obligations were implemented with pragmatism. Regions that cooperated were allowed to retain local customs and leadership structures, provided that they adhered to Mongol authority and contributed to the empire's needs. This approach minimized rebellion and maximized productivity, transforming previously independent or resistant territories into integrated components of a sprawling imperial network. Trade flourished under Genghis Khan's oversight. The Mongol Empire encompassed the Silk Road and other critical routes linking east and west, and the protection of merchants and caravans became a strategic priority. Safe passage was enforced rigorously, and markets were established or stabilized to encourage commerce. By ensuring security and facilitating trade, Genghis Khan created economic networks that not only enriched the empire, but also strengthened loyalty among populations who benefited from the stability he provided. His understanding that wealth could reinforce political control became a defining feature of his reign. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of his governance. Within the empire, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and shamanistic practices were all permitted, and religious leaders were often granted protection and privileges. This pragmatic approach reduced internal conflict and encouraged cooperation among the diverse peoples of the empire. Temples, mosques, and monasteries often served as centers for administration, education, and cultural exchange, further reinforcing the cohesion of territories that might otherwise have remained fractious. By allowing faith to coexist with imperial authority, Genghis Khan demonstrated a nuanced understanding of the socio-political landscape. Even as he consolidated control, the Mongol army remained a tool of projection and deterrence. Campaigns into Eastern Europe and the Middle East showcased both the efficiency and ruthlessness of Genghis Khan's forces. Cities and fortresses that resisted were often destroyed with methodical precision, their populations decimated, their walls shattered. The terror inspired by Mongol conquest preceded the army, sometimes prompting surrender without a single arrow being loosed. Yet, just as in earlier campaigns, this brutality was balanced with pragmatism. Skilled artisans, administrators, and merchants were spared and incorporated into the empire's economic and administrative machinery. In the West, the Mongols encountered diverse political and cultural systems, from the principalities of the Volga region to the Islamic states of Persia. Genghis Khan adapted his tactics to local conditions, employing intelligence networks to gather information, exploiting rivalries among rulers, and using both direct military force and diplomacy to achieve objectives. His campaigns were swift and decisive, demonstrating a strategic vision that transcended conventional steppe warfare. The combination of speed, coordination, and psychological pressure allowed the Mongols to project power over distances and populations that would have overwhelmed earlier empires. Governance relied heavily on the principles that had defined Temujin's rise: meritocracy, discipline, and accountability. Provincial leaders were chosen for competence and loyalty rather than birthright. Soldiers and officials were rewarded for performance, and transgressions were met with immediate consequences. Communication channels, including relay posts and messengers, allowed Genghis Khan to maintain oversight and respond to disturbances rapidly. This blend of central authority and delegated administration created a system capable of sustaining an empire of unprecedented scale, ensuring that power was enforceable without relying solely on fear. The juxtaposition of brutality and visionary policy defined the Mongol Empire. On one hand, cities that resisted faced overwhelming destruction, a terror designed to enforce compliance and prevent future rebellion. On the other, trade flourished, laws were codified, and diverse populations could coexist under Mongol authority. The balance between these approaches was deliberate. Genghis Khan understood that lasting power required both deterrence and incentives, the sword tempered by opportunity. It was a calculated duality, ensuring the longevity of conquest and the stability of administration. Genghis Khan's expansion also facilitated cultural and technological exchange. As the empire connected distant regions, ideas, inventions, and innovations flowed along the trade networks he protected. Scholars, engineers, and merchants moved more freely, and knowledge of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and military engineering spread across continents. Though his campaigns were often violent, the resulting integration of regions under a single political and economic network contributed to a transformation in Eurasian connectivity that would endure long after his death. By the later years of his reign, the Mongol Empire was a complex tapestry of conquest, administration, trade, and cultural integration. Genghis Khan's genius lay not only in his ability to destroy, but in his capacity to organize and sustain. Brutality in war ensured obedience and deterrence, while governance, legal structures, religious tolerance, and economic incentives created loyalty and stability. The Mongols were no longer merely a raiding force. They had become architects of an empire capable of projecting authority across thousands of miles, from the Pacific to the Caspian. Genghis Khan's leadership demonstrated a profound understanding of both human nature and the necessities of empire. He balanced fear with reward, enforced loyalty with law, and extended mercy strategically to reinforce his authority. His vision allowed the Mongols to conquer, integrate, and govern territories of immense size and diversity, creating an empire whose influence reshaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of Eurasia. The boy of the steppe had become a sovereign whose policies, both brutal and enlightened, would leave an enduring legacy. As the sun set over the endless plains of Mongolia, Genghis Khan, now in the later years of his life, had seen his vision realized in ways that few could imagine. From the boy abandoned by his clan to the ruler of an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, he had forged a dominion unlike any the world had witnessed. His campaigns had left cities in ashes, reshaped nations, and transformed the lives of millions. Yet despite the vastness of his accomplishments, his final years were marked not only by reflection, but by the quiet vigilance required to preserve the empire he had built. Even as he aged, Genghis Khan maintained oversight of governance and military affairs. Provincial leaders continued to report through intricate networks of messengers, while military units remained disciplined and mobile under the principles he had established decades earlier. He took care to reinforce succession planning, knowing that the stability of the empire depended on the loyalty of his sons and generals. His experience had taught him that ambition, even among allies and family, could fracture power if left unchecked. Through careful appointments and delegation, he prepared for the inevitable transition that would determine the future of his vast dominion. Despite the outward strength of his empire, Genghis Khan's health declined, shrouding the final years in mystery. Accounts of his death are scarce and contradictory, ranging from injuries sustained in battle to illness, yet the exact circumstances remain unknown. The secrecy surrounding his passing, intentional or otherwise, ensured that his final moments were enveloped in the same legend and awe that had defined his life. His body was returned to Mongol soil and buried in a location concealed from all but a select few, in accordance with nomadic traditions and perhaps to protect his grave from desecration. Even in death, the man of the steppes maintained the enigmatic presence that had inspired both fear and reverence. The succession of his empire was carried out according to the careful plans he had set in motion. His sons, trained in the principles of governance, warfare, and loyalty, assumed authority over their respective territories. Subdivisions of the empire were organized to maintain cohesion while allowing the next generation of Mongol rulers to exercise initiative. Genghis Khan's foresight ensured that the empire did not collapse with his passing, but rather continued to expand, consolidating territories in China, Persia, Central Asia, and eventually reaching into Eastern Europe. His legacy was thus preserved not only in memory, but in the living structure of an empire that spanned continents. The impact of his rule was profound and multifaceted. His military campaigns reshaped political boundaries, toppling dynasties and creating new states under Mongol influence. Trade routes were secured and expanded, linking East and West with unprecedented efficiency, fostering the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies. Cities rebuilt under Mongol administration became centers of commerce and innovation. The Mongol postal system, laws codified in the Yasa, and meritocratic appointments set new standards for governance and inspired future empires across Eurasia. Genghis Khan's influence extended far beyond the battlefield, altering the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the regions he had conquered. Yet alongside these achievements, his reputation for ruthlessness endured. Stories of massacres, sieges, and the merciless punishment of betrayal spread across continents, creating a legacy of fear as much as awe. He demonstrated that power required both inspiration and terror, that loyalty must be enforced and opportunity rewarded. The duality of his rule, brutality in war, visionary organization in governance, defined him as a figure of both horror and admiration. The contrast between destruction and order underscored the complexity of a leader who understood that the permanence of an empire required more than force. It required structure, discipline, and adaptability. Genghis Khan's descendants would carry his vision further than he could have imagined. Under the leadership of his sons and grandsons, the Mongol Empire expanded into China, Russia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Successive generations built upon his systems of governance, trade, and military organization, extending the reach of his influence across continents. The networks, laws, and strategies he established allowed his heirs to consolidate and expand power efficiently, ensuring that his legacy would endure long after his death. The very map of Eurasia was altered by the trajectories set in motion by his leadership. The stories of Genghis Khan transcended mere chronicles of conquest. They became myths that blended historical fact with legend, emphasizing his strategic genius, resilience, and vision. From the humble beginnings of a boy wandering the steppe to the universal ruler commanding armies across deserts, mountains, and rivers, his life became a template for both admiration and fear. Scholars, travelers, and chroniclers sought to understand the man behind the empire, yet he remained in many ways an enigma, a figure shaped by hardship, ambition, and an unyielding will to dominate and unify. Even today, centuries later, the resonance of Genghis Khan's life remains palpable. Cities and empires once destroyed or conquered carry traces of his influence, while the Eurasian trade networks he secured laid the groundwork for exchanges that would last for generations. The balance he struck between fear and governance, brutality and vision, continues to inspire both fascination and study. He transformed the steppe from a fragmented land of tribes into the cradle of a world-changing empire, demonstrating that leadership could emerge from resilience, strategic insight, and an understanding of human nature in all its complexity. In the end, Genghis Khan's life is a story of paradox. A boy abandoned who became a universal ruler, a man of immense cruelty who also enforced fairness, a conqueror whose policies fostered stability and commerce. The shadow of his legacy stretches across centuries, a reminder of the transformative power of ambition, vision, and relentless perseverance. He reshaped the world not merely through conquest, but through innovation, organization, and the audacity to imagine a united empire where none had existed. As the winds sweep across the steppes where he was born, they carry echoes of a life that defies simple comprehension. Genghis Khan, the man who rose from obscurity, who demanded loyalty and punished betrayal, who balanced terror with pragmatism, remains a figure of awe. The empire he created endured long after his passing, and the contours of Eurasia were forever changed by his vision. His story is a testament to the extraordinary capacity of one individual to reshape the course of history, leaving behind a legacy as vast, mysterious, and powerful as the lands he once conquered.